everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling some pretty thought-provoking ideas about race and history and how those two things impact social dynamics today.
Sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. A listener sent in this YouTube clip titled, "This Lawyer Gave a Speech That Left White Folks Upset, Part 2. And it's from a channel called Eugene Docustories, Studio.
Okay, yeah.
Have you heard of that channel?
I have, yeah. Lots of good stuff there.
Yeah, and this particular clip features a speaker named Dr. Tim Wise. And let me tell you, this guy, he really gets you thinking, He just jumps right into some really complex issues.
Definitely. Dr. Wise doesn't shy away from tough topics.
No, he doesn't. And one of the things that really struck me was how he tackles this idea of color blindness. A lot of folks see that's like the answer, right? Like if we just stop seeing race, then racism will magically disappear.
Right, it's a common sentiment.
But Dr. Wise, he kind of flips that on its head. He's like, hold on a second. Let's not just pretend race doesn't exist. Let's really grapple with what it means in our society. So I'm hoping you can help me unpack this a bit.
Sure, happy to.
Why does Dr. Wise see this colorblindness approach as, kind of flawed when it comes to tackling racial issues?
Well, he argues that while it might sound good at first, like, oh, we should just treat everyone the same and all that, it actually ignores the very real historical and systemic realities of racism.
Ah, okay.
It's kind of like, trying to fix a leaky faucet by just painting over the water damage.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, you're not addressing the root cause of the problem. You're just trying to cover it up.
Right, right. And Dr. Wise, he makes this great point about how this whole ignore it and it'll go away approach, it can actually make things worse. Like it allows inequalities to just keep on going.
Exactly. It's like sweeping dust under the rug. It doesn't actually go away. It just builds up.
Exactly. And he gives these really clear examples, like standardized tests. On the surface, they seem fair, right? Everyone takes the same tests.
Seems fair, yeah.
But he argues that they can actually have a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, often because of these long-standing disadvantages that are rooted in history.
Absolutely. Those tests are often built on a foundation that assumes everyone has had equal opportunities to learn and prepare, which, let's be honest, isn't the reality for many students of color.
Right, right. Like some folks are starting the race miles behind the starting line.
That's a perfect analogy.
And it's not just tests. He talks about voting laws, too.
Oh, absolutely. He points out how some of these laws, like voter ID requirements or restrictions on early voting, they might seem race-neutral on paper, but they can end up disproportionately impacting communities of color who may face greater barriers to obtaining those IDs or who rely more heavily on things like early voting.
And that brings me to another really interesting point Dr. Wise brings up. It's this idea that color blindness can actually shut down those important conversations about race.
I think that's one of the most damaging aspects of this approach.
Yeah.
Because when we avoid talking about these things directly, when we pretend race doesn't matter, we lose the opportunity to really understand the issues and work towards, meaningful solutions.
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but we're missing half the pieces.
That's a great way to put it.
So then Dr. Wise, he shifts gears a little bit. He starts talking about this, this kind of funny analogy.
Really, the gumbo analogy. I love that one.
Yes. It's about a pot of leftover gumbo. I won't spoil it for our listeners, but can you tell us how this story, which on the surface is kind of humorous, connects back to his main point?
Well, on the surface, it's this funny story about, coming home to this pot of gumbo that's been sitting out on the counter, getting, worse by the day.
A little ripe, maybe?
Yeah, a little ripe. And the point he makes is that even though you didn't make the gumbo, you still got to deal with the mess.
Right, right.
And it's kind of like how we inherit the consequences of historical injustices, even if we weren't personally involved in those wrongs in the past.
I see, I see. So even if we didn't cook up that metaphorical pot of gumbo, we're still left with the aftermath.
Exactly. We can't just pretend it's not there. We all got to figure out how to clean it up together.
It's like we're all stuck in this kitchen together. I got to figure out how to deal with this, shall we say, fragrant situation.
Yeah. And just like you wouldn't want to live in a house with that, that lingering smell, we have a responsibility to try to address the ongoing impact of those historical injustices, even if we weren't the ones who created them.
And that makes me think about another point Dr. Wise makes, which is that we really can't tackle these big issues we're facing today, things like immigration, criminal justice reform, wealth inequality, without really understanding history.
He's a big believer in historical context, and I think he's right. Yes. I mean, if you don't know how we got here, how can we possibly figure out where we're going?
That's a really good point. It's like you can't just clean up the gumbo without knowing what ingredients went into it in the first place.
Exactly.
Speaking of immigration, Dr. Wise really flips the script on some common narratives, especially when it comes to Mexican immigration.
Oh, yeah, he goes there.
He does. He makes this really bold statement saying that Mexican immigrants, whether they have documentation or not, are essentially coming home.
It's a provocative statement, for sure.
It is. Can you break that down for us a bit? What's he getting at with that?
Well, he points out that many Mexican families have roots in the region that, go way back, long before the arrival of European settlers. So, in a sense, they're returning to land that their ancestors may have lived on for generations.
Wow. So it's like he's challenging this whole idea of who the real Americans are.
He's definitely turning the tables on that narrative.
Yeah, it makes you think about, like, who has the right to be here and how we define belonging, you know?
Right. It challenges those assumptions.
It totally does. And then he goes even further. He starts poking holes in this whole romanticized view of why those early European settlers came to America in the first place.
He's like, hold on, it wasn't all about freedom and opportunity.
No. He suggests that many of them were actually motivated by, pretty practical concerns, like they were running from poverty, they were seeking land and a chance to just survive. Kind of like a lot of immigrants today, honestly.
Exactly. He draws a direct parallel between those early settlers and modern-day immigrants, saying that they were often driven by the same basic human needs.
He even paints this, I don't know, this kind of funny image of some well-to-do Englishman in the 1600s, leaving behind a comfortable life to risk it all on this dangerous journey across the Atlantic.
Like, what would make someone leave everything they know behind to go to a completely unknown and potentially dangerous place?
It's a good question. And, it kind of makes you rethink those stories that we tell ourselves about, the American dream and all that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a reminder that our history is a lot more complicated than the simple narratives we often hear.
Absolutely. But then Dr. Wise makes this really important distinction. It's between feeling guilty about the past and taking responsibility for the present and the future.
This is a crucial point. He doesn't want us to get bogged down in guilt. He wants us to use our understanding of history to create a more just future.
It's like, it's not about wallowing in shame. It's about like rolling up our sleeves and saying, okay, what can we do to make things better?
Exactly. He wants us to move from guilt to action.
And he even says this very specific phrase, it's not about white people per se, it's about whiteness as a system. Can you help our listener unpack that a little bit? What does he mean by whiteness as a system?
Sure. When he talks about whiteness as a system, he's not talking about individual white people. He's talking about the way that advantages and disadvantages are built into our institutions, our laws, our culture, in a way that often favors white people over people of color.
So it's like it's bigger than individual people.
Much bigger. It's about the structures and systems that perpetuate racial inequality, even if individuals within those systems don't have explicitly racist intentions.
So if this colorblindness thing isn't the answer, what does Dr. Wise suggest we do instead? Like, what's the alternative?
He proposes this idea of color consciousness.
Color consciousness.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging the realities of race and racism and understanding that pretending they don't exist doesn't actually solve anything.
Okay, so what would that look like in practice? What does it mean to be color conscious?
Well, it starts with recognizing that race does have a real impact on people's lives. It shapes their experiences, their opportunities, and the way they're treated by society.
So it's not just about seeing race, it's about understanding the implications of race in a very real way.
That's a great way to put it.
And that sounds, I don't know, a lot more challenging than just trying to be blind to race.
It is challenging. But Dr. Wise argues that it's the only way to truly dismantle the systems of inequality that are rooted in our history and continue to affect our present.
I see. So we got to lean into that discomfort, that complexity.
I think so. Because pretending it's not there won't make it go away.
Okay, so how do we start to do that? What are some concrete things we can do to, move towards this idea of color consciousness?
Well, he suggests some pretty specific measures. Things like affirmative action, reparations.
Whoa, those are some big topics. I can already imagine folks having a lot of opinions about those.
They are. But his point is that we need to be willing to have those difficult conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they challenge our existing beliefs.
Yeah.
Because that's how real change happens.
Yeah, you're right. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and hope things will magically get better on their own. We got to be willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And I think that's where we'll pick up in the next part of this deep dive. We'll explore some of those concrete actions, those measures that Dr. Wise proposes, and unpack what they might mean for each of us.
This is definitely getting me thinking. Can't wait to dive in further.
Me neither.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a short break. And one of the areas where this idea of whiteness as a system really comes into play is when we look at wealth disparity in America.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
It is. And Dr. Wise points out that white families in the U.S., on average, they have significantly more wealth, like net worth, than Black or Latino families.
That's a fact that's hard to ignore.
It is. And he really challenges this idea that it's all just about individual choices, Like,
Right.
if you work hard, you'll succeed, regardless of your race.
He argues that it's just not that simple.
No, he doesn't. So what's his take on it?
Well, he says that the legacy of slavery and systemic discrimination, it's created all these barriers that make it much harder for Black and Latino families to build wealth, even generations later.
It's like those historical injustices. They've created this ripple effect that we're still dealing with today.
Exactly. It's like imagine a race where some runners have been held back for centuries. Even if you remove the barriers today, they're still starting way behind everyone else.
That's a powerful image. It makes you realize that we can't just focus on the present. We got to understand how the past continues to shape our present reality.
Absolutely. Historical context is crucial if we want to truly understand these issues.
And speaking of historical context, Dr. Wise connects these historical realities to some of the most pressing issues we face today. Things like policing and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Oh yeah, he dives right into those topics.
He does. So I'm curious, how does he link the history of policing to the Black Lives Matter movement? What's the connection there?
Well, he argues that policing in America, from its very origins, it's been intertwined with the control and oppression of Black and brown communities.
So it's not just about enforcing the law objectively, it's about maintaining a certain power structure.
That's his point. He says it's not a neutral force. It's often been used to uphold systems of inequality.
And he actually traces this all the way back to slave patrols, right? Like those early forms of law enforcement that were specifically designed to, control enslaved people.
Exactly. And he argues that this legacy of control and oppression, it continues to influence policing today, even if it's not as overt as it was in the past.
So those historical patterns, they're still playing out in different ways.
That's his argument. And he uses that historical lens to help explain why the call for Black Lives Matter is so important.
Yeah, it's a phrase that sparked a lot of controversy, but it seems like he's saying it's not just about saying that Black lives are the only ones that matter.
No, not at all. It's about recognizing a group that has been systematically devalued and marginalized, often by the very institutions that are supposed to protect them.
So it's about demanding that Black lives be treated with the same dignity and respect as any other lives.
Exactly. It's about correcting a historical imbalance, acknowledging the ways in which Black lives have been systematically disregarded.
And this idea of demanding recognition for a marginalized group, it reminds me of other social movements we've seen throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. He draws parallels to the LGBTQ plus rights movement,
Right.
the fight against HIV/AIDS, the women's rights movement.
All these groups that have had to fight to be seen, to be heard, to have their rights recognized.
And he argues that when a group has been systematically marginalized, ignored, silenced for so long, sometimes you have to explicitly state that your lives matter.
It's like you have to force society to confront that reality.
Exactly. It's a powerful statement that challenges the status quo.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, Dr. Wise's discussion of immigration, it also kind of forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our own history, doesn't it?
Definitely. He doesn't shy away from pointing out the hypocrisy of criticizing immigrants for coming for stuff.
Yeah.
When that's, pretty much what European settlers did.
It's like he's turning the tables on us. He's saying, look, we did this too. We can't pretend we're innocent in all of this.
And he dismantles this whole romanticized notion that those early European immigrants were all just noble pioneers seeking freedom and opportunity.
He's like, come on, let's be real. A lot of them were running from poverty, seeking a better life, just like many immigrants today.
Yeah. He says they are often driven by the same basic human desires, the same need to survive and provide for their families.
And he makes this really interesting point about how we often hear that those early European immigrants, they came legally. But as he points out, there were no immigration laws back then.
It's like, how can you come legally when there are no laws to break?
It makes you think about how our current immigration system, it's built on a foundation that's I don't know, kind of arbitrary in a way.
He's definitely highlighting those contradictions and inconsistencies in our thinking about immigration.
So after all of this, this deep dive into history, this challenging of our assumptions, where does Dr. Wise want to leave us? What's his ultimate message?
Well, I think his main point is that understanding history is essential for dismantling the systems of inequality that we see all around us.
He's not just saying, let's feel bad about the past. He's saying, let's use this knowledge to create a better future.
Exactly. He's saying, let's stop pretending race doesn't matter and start acknowledging the ways in which it continues to shape our world.
That's his call for color consciousness, right?
Exactly. And I think that's a really good place to start as we move into the next part of our conversation. We'll explore what it means to be color conscious and what kinds of actions we can take to dismantle those systems of inequality.
Sounds good to me. Let's take another quick break and then we'll dive back in. So we're back, and we've been having this really fascinating conversation about Dr. Tim Wise's thoughts on race, history, and how we move towards a more just and equitable society.
It's heavy stuff, but important.
It is, and one of the things that's really sticking with me is his idea of moving beyond color blindness to color consciousness.
Yeah, that's a powerful shift in thinking.
It is, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that looks like in practice. Like, how do we actually move from just seeing race to understanding its real impact on people's lives?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that race isn't just this abstract concept. It's something that has very real consequences for people's experiences, their opportunities, their access to resources, even their safety.
So it's like we can't just say, oh, I treat everyone the same and then pat ourselves on the back and call it a day, right?
Right. It's about looking beyond our individual intentions and acknowledging the ways in which our society is structured in a way that often advantages some groups over others.
It's about understanding those systemic issues, those historical patterns that continue to play out, even if we don't always see them.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that even if we haven't personally done anything to contribute to those systems, we might still be benefiting from them.
And that means we have a responsibility to do something about it, right?
I think so. It's not about feeling guilty, it's about taking action.
Okay, so what kinds of actions are we talking about here? What can we actually do to dismantle those systems of inequality?
Well, Dr. Wise suggests some pretty concrete measures like affirmative action and reparations.
Now, those are some pretty big ideas. And I know they can be kind of controversial.
They are. But I think his point is that we can't be afraid to have those tough conversations, to consider solutions that might make some people uncomfortable.
It's like we're not going to get anywhere if we just stick to the easy stuff, right?
Right. Real change requires us to step outside of our comfort zones, to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those concrete actions. What does affirmative action actually look like in practice?
Well, it's basically about taking proactive steps to create more opportunities for groups that have been historically excluded or discriminated against.
Mm.
So, for example, in college admissions, it might mean giving preference to students from underrepresented minority groups.
And that's designed to, like, level the playing field a bit.
Exactly. Because we know that those students have often faced greater barriers to education, so this is a way to try to compensate for those disadvantages.
And reparations, that's even more controversial, right? Like, how do you even begin to address the harms of slavery and segregation in a tangible way?
It's a really complex issue. But the basic idea is that because those historical injustices had had such a lasting impact on Black communities, some form of compensation or restitution is owed.
So that could be financial, it could be educational, it could be a whole range of things.
Right. There are a lot of different ideas about what reparations might look like in practice. But the main point is that we need to acknowledge the harm that was done and take concrete steps to repair it.
And Dr. Wise argues that these are not just like abstract ideas, they're essential if we want to create a truly just and equitable society.
Exactly. He sees them as crucial steps towards dismantling those systems of inequality that we've been talking about.
And it's not just about policies, right? It's also about those individual actions, those everyday choices we make that can either reinforce or challenge those systems.
Absolutely. Like who we support with our money, who we vote for, who we choose to listen to and learn from, all of those things make difference.
So I guess the big question is, where do we go from here? What are some things our listeners can do to start putting these ideas into action?
Well, I think a good starting point is just being more aware of the ways in which race shapes our world.
So like paying attention to those news stories that highlight racial disparities, reading books and articles by authors of color, really just expanding our understanding of these issues.
Exactly. And then it's about taking that awareness and using it to inform our actions. So that might mean supporting organizations that are working to advance racial justice, speaking out against racism when we see it, having those tough conversations with our family and friends.
So it's moving beyond our comfort zones, right?
Absolutely. Because real change doesn't happen when we stay silent.
And I think that's a really powerful message to end on. It's not enough to just be not racist. We have to be actively
Couldn't
anti-racist.
have said it better myself.
Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But I hope this conversation has given you some things to think about and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, even small steps can make a big difference when it comes to creating a more just and equitable world for everyone. Thanks for listening.